This is Halleck Hoffman speaking from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. The work of the Center is directed toward clarifying the problems and issues facing the American people in the 20th century, particularly as institutions have been affected by technological change. One of our studies has been directed toward examining the impact of social institutions on moral and cultural standards of the American character. And in this study, as in all the projects undertaken by the Center, specialists from every discipline are invited from time to join the staff in its deliberations. Among those participants was Dr. Ralph Greenson, training psychoanalyst and associate professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of California School of Medicine in Los Angeles. The broadcast that follows was an informal conversation that took place after the formal meeting was over between Dr. Greenson and Richard Lichtman of our staff. The first voice is Dr. Greenson's.
Something I have noticed in recent times, very strikingly, is how few of my patients have intense friendships. Mm-hmm. In my day, it was characteristic you had friends, and you had best friends. Mm-hmm. And it was also characteristic that you changed these best friends when you were younger, and then when you were older, there were a few people who mattered greatly to you in an emotional sense. And how today, for example, in a recent argument I had with a colleague of mine, he turned in anger at me and said, "You and your friends, what is this with you having friends?" And said it as though I was guilty of something wrong or peculiar or bizarre, pathological. And I pondered this, and then I noticed, as I listened to patients or observed other people who I know socially, how rare it is for people to have a relationship with a person of the same gender, particularly, and indicate, obviously and openly, I care. I love this man. It matters to me what happens. I'm partial to him. And how people tend to either to deny this, to avoid this, or to belittle it. And I wondered, what is this all about? What has happened to friendship and the meaning of friendship that it has become now synonymous with acquaintanceship? That when you say, I have lots of friends, you mean I have lots of people I know little and who know me little. And that popularity, apparently, with great numbers of people has replaced the importance of a few people who mean a great deal to you in terms of emotional involvement. So that's the kind of thing I was interested in hearing your point of view about. Because I see it, and I wonder, do you have any ideas about this that we could talk about?
I see it too, and I have very vague and sketchy ideas about what it might be related to. One thing that it's possibly related to is the enormous sense of movement and change and the lack of permanence in location in the society. And that would fit in with, that would be plausible because the amount of mobility has certainly been increasing in later generations. Therefore, it wouldn't be a function, let's say, of a capitalist system itself or social structure so much as it is of the extremely rapid motion and of the relatively little time that people spend in any given location, because it certainly follows. I mean, I don't mean just geographical location, I mean functional location too. Your loyalties are always changing, your associations are always changing. You move up into a corporate hierarchy, for example. The person with whom you once had loyalties is not the person you're going to see at the next stage. To become too attached to a person whom you surpass in your business enterprise is not profitable. To be able to change your attachments quickly to the person at the next echelon from whom you can derive some advantages at a given point now is extremely important. And even the simple physiological sense that one doesn't live in a city that long. To permit himself to become acquainted with friends. Part of this may be a defensive mechanism. If you become very attached to individuals and you leave them, of course, it's painful. You Freud made a little remark in Civilization and Its Discontents about the defense against love and its sublimation into a general forms to buffet the defense against losing a loved object.
All right. Now you're touching on a crucial point, I think, at least what I think is a crucial point, that part of this uninvolvement, or this tendency to uninvolvement, is a defense against losing someone whom you love. It's therefore you don't invest so much emotion. because you're afraid of losing, which now ties up with many different things. One of them is the dread of grieving, and how grief is still one of the emotional reactions that we are ill-prepared to endure. In other words, we don't feel loving is worth it because grieving is so painful, and our society makes poor preparation for us to grieve.
Would you agree also, though, that there are probably two sides to the situation? You could focus on one or the other. You could focus on the distinctively psychological phenomenon of grief, or you could focus on the changes that make the grief more likely. That is, there may be more objective reason to think that you're going to lose friends in societies that's now constituted.
True.
The case. If you lived
True.
in a small New England town, for example, and spent your whole life there,
And knew you were going to
the
spend your
man
life
across
there.
the way was
Yes.
going to be there for 40 years.
And you knew you had to deal with him, and you had to contend with him. And so you made all kinds of adaptations in order to do it. I agree.
Then I just would throw in as another social theme, there's probably a hint here, Greenson and the notion of other-directedness, and the notion of taking the clue as to how one ought to behave, not, let's say, from the superego or the ideal of one's parent, understood as having been derived either from the gospel or some Christian tradition or such, but from the continuing shifts in society. I just have the vague feeling that there's something in the thesis that if you begin to take your sense of what's proper for you, from observing the group at large, you have to become adapted to the group at large, and not to
Yes.
a small segment of it.
Right.
And therefore, your popularity and your success becomes measured almost by how well you fit into the group at large.
Right.
So that any distinct individual of the group
Right.
is almost a sign of failure. It shows that you haven't been able to adopt to the masses of those individuals.
Right. In other words,
Loyalty.
the love of the group and the wish to belong replaces loving relationships. It's a regression, I would say, in my sense, a psychoanalytic sense of the word. One regresses back to where belonging is more important than loving. And this is a theoretical point, but a very important clinical point.
You know, there's a wonderful phrase I could throw out here. It almost sounds as though it was invented by Orwell, but I swear it's true, and I could find the reference. Some high school students were being interviewed on what it was that made them popular. And the girl said, in rhyme, it was her own rhyme, though I don't think she was conscious of making it, being too smart sets you apart. It almost reads like one of the Orwellian slogans from 1984. But of course, being very attached to one individual as against the group would also set you apart.
But more than that, I want to say this, that the most primitive form of possessing something you love is to become it, to take it in, to become one with it, to transform yourself in its image, i.e., to identify with it. Identification is the forerunner of loving and opposed to loving in a curious way. On the one hand, it's the most primitive form of loving, or it's the antecedent of loving. In another way, it is the enemy of loving, because you become that which you love, he whom you love, instead of loving him.
Meaning you absorb it instead of respecting.
You absorb it.
its
You see this in homosexuality.
But no, I don't know whether I'm admitting to a perversion of a sort in myself, but it seems to me there are times when that desire to identify comes almost from another source, too. This isn't taking us afield.
Well, I don't mind going
When I
afield.
pick up,
Depends on the field.
my infant, who's 10 months old,
Yeah.
and I feel at times that I have a desire to embrace him so thoroughly that I'm almost ingesting him. It's almost in part because I don't have any of the proper modes of response where which to show love ordinarily as I would with other people.
Yes.
I can't speak to him
Yes.
and talk to him and tell him that I love. I can't do things with him which would be objects of love.
Yeah.
And I'm reduced almost, if it's a kind of reduction, but it's appropriate to his level
Yeah.
and appropriate to our relation at that point. I am required to do the only thing I can do to
That's
express
right.
to him.
You are
exactly
reduced
his
to a
love.
pre-verbal, non-verbal, non-ideational contact, and that's body contact, and that gets awfully close to taking in, ingesting, incorporating, identifying, and so on. I think it is true. But it also, I think, there's another important element, and that is, if you can possess someone in that physical sense of incorporating them or introjecting them, there's less danger of losing them. See, it is also a fear of taking the risk. Love is risk-taking. If you love, you can lose. You can be hurt. Whereas if you take them in, you have them.
Let me me see if there's a point of contact between this and two other things that puzzle me very much. One has to do with contemporary advertising, and the other has to do with the feature of pornography. And I'd be happy for the attempt to put it to a psychoanalyst. Now, I notice in looking at a lot of advertising in magazines, newspapers, and television, I feel that an enormous amount of advertising directed to women seems to me to be autoerotic. And it seems to me to be the case that this is growing in the case of men. One bathes not so much to get clean as to be able to stroke one's body in the bath. That is at least the way the image is presented. One puts on the undergarment nowadays not so much even to control the body as to be caressed by it. I have the impression that either consciously or unconsciously the advertiser is making this kind of appeal to a woman. And that if she followed out the image of the model in the ad, she would be performing a certain kind of autoerotic act upon herself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wonder whether that isn't finally the most secure form, if you want, most perhaps infantile and regressive, the most secure form of assuring love. If one loves oneself, finally, that presents, it seems, the least opportunity of losing both the lover and the loved object, because they're coincident in a single person.
Yeah.
Does that make any
Oh, yes, it makes very good sense. What you're saying, if I were to say this in psychoanalytic terms, would to be to say that narcissism has a very important defensive function. It protects you against the loss of any object because you invest not in an object, but something that belongs to you or is a part of you. And the advertisers are capitalizing on this. They're offering you security, not by becoming lovable, but by possessing certain things. And they want to sell things to you, which you can own. They're part of yourself. And whether they know it or not, they're playing into the hands of a kind of a narcissistic tendency anyway in our society, which means they're in opposition to what we would call, I think, love relationships, which are risky and always have with them the danger of this terrible feeling
I think
of
what I
loss.
described is really there. And if you look at a large number of deodorant ads and soap ads and all these sorts of ads involving cleanliness, that this characteristic really does show.
Well, the whole emphasis on security, by and large. Make yourself safe. Protect yourself from certain dangers is all narcissistic. One protects oneself always. Love is a dangerous business because your focus is on somebody else, whereas so much emphasis on all this health business is also a kind of narcissism. Protect yourself, live long, not live well, live long is another variety of the same thing.
Well, let me balance that from something else that's always puzzled me. My interest in pornography comes really from the problem of civil rights and the First Amendment.
Don't try to explain it to me because I want to believe it. Go on.
All right.
All right. Just,
So you won't
yeah.
get into the problem
No,
of
don't tell what
sexualization.
made you interested in it. Yeah.
Let me put it this way, that's the focus of my interest. But here's an interesting psychological fact that I've noticed that doesn't seem to me ever been touched on in the literature and explained very well. It's obviously possible for people to write pornography for themselves. Anybody could sit down, anybody has the technical capacity, was it in any amount of intelligence, to write out a passage describing sexual acts and doing it in great detail. But it's never done that way.
That's right.
And I have the impression that it's not pleasurable to do it that way, and I have the impression, furthermore, that it's something like trying to tickle oneself.
Mm-hmm.
That there's something in the fact that the material comes directed to you from the outside, that it's objectively presented to you, that you know when you're reading it that it's not something which you've made up, that you add all sorts of fantasies to it.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me to make it exciting.
That's right.
It seems to me, therefore, to be very different from masturbatory fantasies,
That's
where
right.
you make them up and you know that you're making them up.
But even for a masturbatory fantasy to be exciting, it has to be perceived as though someone else were doing. It has to be imagined as someone else is doing something or you're doing something to somebody else. For excitement in general, there must be another person. There must be a difference. There must be a stranger. That's dangerous, but it's exciting. And so a pornography, in order for it to be exciting, must have an otherness about it. It must be somebody else. One would never be able really, I think, to get any kind of even autoerotic gratification if one couldn't imagine that this is a repetition of something that happened with somebody else. It's an imitation, in some crude way, perhaps, of something that happened with something else, because sameness makes for security, not for excitement. And I think there's a very important point here that we're talking about.
You think that would help to account for the fact that it's not exciting unless the material is presented to you in some way?
That's right. It comes from a stranger. Someone else had this fantasy, and now you can use the fact that someone else even had it to make it exciting, whereas if it's your own, it's familiar. And anything familiar is security-giving, but it's not exciting. It's a whole difference between what makes for excitement and what makes for safety, and this goes back to the whole business about friendship again. There is a danger to have a friend and be emotionally involved. And there are many. One of them is the danger of losing them. Another I wanted to mention about the decline in friendship among people of the same sex is the terrible fear of homosexuality, which seems to me more and more prevalent in our society. That there are all kinds of indications that the struggle against or the fear of anything homosexuality or the inability to discriminate between liking, loving, and being sexually involved with someone you care about plays an important role in why people tend to diminish love relationships with people of the same sex.
Now, would it be reasonable to at least hypothesize that the fear of homosexuality tends to grow in the society as the security of masculine roles begins to fade?
Or feminine roles.
Well, they both fade at the same time.
There's a blurring of the differences. It's not so clear anymore.
Therefore, it pays to be more cautious than one would ordinarily be.
Yeah, and then you see another development. Instead of friendships between individuals, you see attempts at friendships with couples. Couples try to become friendly with couples, but that's almost impossible for very interesting reasons. I don't know if you ever thought about how hard it is to become involved with another couple. Usually there's one person in the couple that you like. It's so rare to find...
the one your wife doesn't like.
Isn't it? Now, it's a striking business, but you see, if you have the security, I have my wife, and therefore I am a man, and she is a woman, and we know who we are, we know our genders. Now, in this situation, I dare to love another man or a woman. But isn't it curious how much harder it is to love as couples?
What I'm saying is that the characteristics of manhood are not as clearly drawn as they once were.
Yeah.
It was clear at one time that a certain kind of aggressive behavior was masculine behavior, par excellence.
Yeah.
Now you begin to learn, and this may be an advance in the culture, that that kind of aggressiveness really ought not to define what it is to be a man.
Right.
That there are forms of culture and art, and dance, for example, which is a fine example of homosexual fear in our culture, which may very well be proper activities for a man, but are not permitted to be so. Then you've got to be extremely cautious about what you permit yourself to do with other men.
Right.
Because what you're saying to yourself, I suppose, is, this may be the kind of gesture appropriate with a woman, I suppose.
Yes, you see, what's happened, I think, is, well, there's so many things that have happened. Partly, there's been a sexual revolution in a way, and the role of the man as the person of the couple who was interested in sexuality and the wife who was passive, that's changed. In our society today, the women are much more active pursuing sexual satisfaction, I think, and men are much more passive about it. It's much harder to be a masculine figure in a society which is so dominated by these enormous industrial and scientific advances when we are all so relatively helpless before them. You know, in a world where the single man could be a heroic figure in some small way, it's terribly hard to be a heroic figure for a man today. And at the same time, women have more freedom to take over certain what we used to think were masculine activities. So it gets blurry. What does make the difference between a man and a woman anyway? And how sure are you to have achieved this masculine aim or a masculine position if you are working for an organization where all your life's work is not how competent you are, but how well you ingratiate yourself with the boss? Well, that's feminine, isn't it? Isn't that what it is? The organization man is not very much of a masculine figure.
100 years ago, when men had strong ties to other men, say industrial ties, union ties, when one went and got drunk on a given night with other men and sat in a bar or a tavern or so and slapped a fellow on the back and so on, it was possible to show a certain kind of affection at that time, I suppose.
Yeah.
But now, what's happened to the character of the affection now? I want you to pick up your remark about the couples, which interests me, because another phenomenon which is curious is that I notice men are often capable of having, it seems, profounder friendships with women, seems to me, unless I just misread from myself, than they are with other men. And I wonder if there isn't in that some kind of competitive fear of the man who does compete with you in a way in a business way, in which at least the woman doesn't compete.
Yes, but isn't there also the point that as long as there was this marked difference in the rights of men and women, and the lines were clearly drawn that the men could go to the bar and the women not. The men could drink and the women not. As that has changed, and there's been a greater equality, that you're depriving the men by this equality of their badge of distinction. And therefore they have to they are become more afraid of this, again, this blurring of the differences in the genders. So, and isn't this why then you can find men having friendships with women? Because there's no threat of homosexuality in this. At worst, it's only polygamous and promiscuous. And that's not so bad. You know, there is a far greater taboo and a greater stigma to being homosexual in our society than there is in being promiscuous.
Yeah, well, because heterosexuality is a permitted form of sexual outlet, and turning it to what a man isn't. But then the whole teenage experience becomes interesting, because that seems to be about the last possible stage in one's growth at which certain attachments for a boy to other boys or girls to other girls are still permitted. However much they may have changed, it's still possible. Well, of course, homosexuality always carries less of a stigma for girls than it does for men, it seems, in this culture. So when a girl goes to a pajama party and sleeps with other girls, that's permissible, and that's always been permissible, just as a girl kissing another girl.
But do you notice, in line with what you were saying, how the heroes, the idols of the teenagers is ambiguous in terms of gender? The Beatle, with his long hair and his ways and mannerisms, is not a decidedly masculine figure. And if you go down over the years, wasn't it always so that the idol, very often, I won't say always, was someone who was not particularly masculine? Look at Rudy Valley, look at Frank Sinatra. In those days, Sinatra has changed from this fragile man who clung to the microphone. He's a tough guy now. But in those days, isn't it interesting to see the kind of curious bisexuality of these figures?
What really interests me even more is why it's the case that the idol has always been a man to a teenage girl rather than a woman to a teenage boy. I can think of almost no woman singer who ever had the mass appeal of a masculine popular singer for girls. And the same thing goes on today. It was Elvis Presley first. There's no comparable girl singer who excites men or teenage boys to that extent. And there's no group of women who will excite teenage boys. And if you look at an audience of teenagers following any of these rock and roll people, or whatever the musical term is these days, I don't think you'll find the same kind of excitement on the part of boys as you'll see on the part of girls.
But isn't that due to the fact that, by and large, it is characteristic for girls and women to have heroes all the time? The men they love become heroes.
But isn't it possible, too, that boys are granted more outlets, let's say, of a masturbatory kind, which they're generally expected, and whatever the culture may say with one voice, every boy understands that other boys do it, and it's a permitted kind of behavior, and he fantasies along private lines. I almost get the feeling at times girls don't have that kind of outlet and turn in almost in a sublimated way to a cultural form of a fantasy creation.
Well,
they engage in common with other girls rather than by themselves in their own privacy.
But that's correct. I think absolutely correct in it. I think what it is the characteristic of adolescence to share a common lover, which is it's a homosexual activity anyway. We love the same person. That's true for both men and women, the sharing of it. And I think with girls, they were always permitted much more affection in their relation to other girls than boys are.
But you'd have to say girls share them publicly and men share them privately.
Right. Okay. All right.
It's almost like the old song about how you sell clothes to men and women. You say to women, everybody's wearing one, and you say to a man, nobody else has one. There must be some tie there.
It's the other way around.
I beg your pardon. Now, how is it supposed to be?
A woman, you have to say, nobody has such a dress.
Right. You say
she's got the unique thing. And a man, you say, come on, what are you worried about? Everyone's wearing it, for God's sakes. Yes.
But then the trends in dressing and lovers run differently.
Yeah.
But that's a form of protection for a girl, isn't it, too? That is that the loving in a group just prevents you from really taking seriously the possibility that you would love this person individually and he'd love you in return.
Well, it is
it's a testing period.
Yeah, it's also, however, a derivative of the fact that, you see, she has a much harder time in making a transition to loving anyway to a heterosexual object, because she started out loving the mother, and she's got to make that tremendous step that the boy never makes. The boy starts out loving women, and if he's lucky, ends up loving women. And the girl has to go from loving her mother to loving a heterosexual object. She's got a much harder road to pursue. And she needs all kinds of transitional things to make it possible, including sharing a love object with a whole flock of other girls. They all scream and swoon about the same guy. But that still has traces of loving the girls or the women along with it.
There's one thing that we ought to note, I think, before the conversation ends, and that's a possibility that some of the psychological explanations may lose some of their force because of the fact that the manner in which styles are dictated and exploited by commercial interests, which have some profit motive in exploiting them, is probably going to mean that a half a dozen styles are going to replace each other very rapidly within the course of a given year, and they're going to have no real connection to any psychological need on the part of these children, but is simply the requirement that you change the fad very quickly. So it wouldn't at all startle me if next year the fad suddenly became crew cuts, and everybody wore them, and the power of that commercial industry was sufficient to get the crew cut accepted, and the image went back to being a very masculine image.
I don't deny.
I wouldn't be surprised if they fluctuated very rapidly.
Yes, I would not deny that, but I would also say even the advertisers have a psychology we have to understand, so that even there you can't escape the individual psychology of these people and why they do or pick these particular things. But I agree, they're terribly influential.
But the need for difference is going to be just a crucial need in itself.
Yeah.
The need for doing something other than what was done the last time.
Yes, difference and change, and as long as we keep people in a state of discontent or disequilibrium, they will buy more, they will do more, they will be more active. This is a whole pitch about keeping people stirred up so they never get complacent, so they will buy more, do more, which is all to the value of those who want to sell goods to the consumer. And this is part of, I think, the terrible function of advertising. But, if you go back now to what we started talking about, what's happened to friendship, particularly friendship among men, for men, then you can see it's a bad investment in many ways. Psychologically, it's a bad investment. There's so much risk. And in other ways, it's a bad investment because it is not to the benefit of those who want to sell goods of various kinds and keep people in a state of discontent and mobile and changeable so that we can produce more and make them consume more, etc., etc. And I think all of this somehow comes together when we see how we push in certain directions because of our psychological makeup, and certain institutions pushes in certain directions, and then certain financial institutions also influence us and manipulate us without our knowing it to go in this way. And it's terribly hard for someone to maintain a sense of continuity or a sense of identity in terms of the self, in terms of what does he want and what does he stand for and what does he believe in.
Of course, that last point comes back to the point that not only do friendships get eroded, but the counterpart probably is that the idea of what a friendship is changes radically.
Yes.
And that how you define a friendship in this period is probably more in terms of what people do for you, and probably that more in a commercial context than previously.
That's
what you
right.
do for them, and that becomes probably the sign of who your friends are.
Yeah. What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of it? Becomes now the dominant slogan. And in terms of what am I getting, instead of the pleasure in this interchange between giving and getting, which has to do with love, and the emphasis on the getting, which is really, a part of our society today. What's in it for me? What am I going to get?
You can almost say that the giving has been abstracted from a larger function of feeling.
Yeah.
In any genuine relationship, one would want to give. That would be natural to the relationship.
Right.
One would want to give out of the motive of feeling, rather than out of the motive of understanding what one could derive from the act of giving.
Agreed. Good. Fine. Let's stop.
You have been listening to an informal conversation between Dr. Ralph Greenson, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at the University of California School of Medicine, and Richard Lichtman of the staff of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. And this is Halleck Hoffman speaking from the center.